So we're going to get started on this session. This is one of the sessions that was most interesting to me because we in financial reporting have a lot of framework around accountability, and it doesn't seem to exist over in platforms where we disseminate a lot more information that affects society. So I asked Nerissa Brown to moderate this panel. She's the Associate Dean of Graduate Programs at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. She's also the Professor of Accountancy, and her research includes capital markets consequences of corporate financial reporting, managers' strategic disclosure of investors' responses to non-standard financial measures, and the role of behavioral biases in dissemination and the use of financial information for capital markets. It's my pleasure to introduce Nerissa, who's going to introduce the rest of the panel for you.
Thank you, Alan, and welcome everyone to this awesome panel on platform accountability versus free speech rights. As Alan noted, I'm a professor of accountancy where I do work related to financial reporting, but also financial misreporting and fraud. So the work that I do touches more on the edge with respect to misinformation and malinformation. So I was really pleased to learn about the definition of misinformation, malinformation, and disinformation this morning. And also in my role as Associate Dean of Graduate Programs, I operate programs that are at scale, and we do have platforms that our learners do converse with each other on those platforms. And even in my current role, I've had to do a deep dive and actually learn pretty quickly about free speech rights and how we should also monitor these platforms and work with students and have them think about what they are posting as well. So it's my pleasure to kick off this exciting discussion on the complex balance between information dissemination, platform accountability, and free speech rights. We have an awesome panel of legal and policy experts here who I'm pleased to introduce. First, I'll introduce Leah Chauhan, who is the policy lead for misinformation and disinformation on the online safety team of the UK's Office of Communications, commonly referred to as Ofcom. Leah previously was the Europe, Middle East, and Africa Account Director at Albany Associates, a strategic communications company where she implemented programming for the EU and the UN, as well as the UK and US governments in preventing and countering misinformation and disinformation. Next, right beside Leah, is Stefan Thiel, who is the John Thornely Fellow and Director of Studies in Law here at the University of Cambridge at the Sidney Sussex College. Stefan conducts research on public and constitutional law and is an expert on free expression and protest rights, particularly with respect to dominant social media platforms. And last but by no means least, I have Agne Kaarlep, who is the head of policy at Tremau, which is a trust and safety startup. And in her role, she is helping the industry with respect to making platforms safer. Prior to this role, Agne was a policy officer at the European Commission in the team that wrote the Digital Services Act, which we're going to touch on today. And in that role, she worked on developing policies to counter online harms. So thank you to our panelists. And before we start, everyone, just give them a huge round of applause.
Yeah.
For the audience, could you share the current state of platform accountability in your jurisdictions, particularly the UK and EU, and just talk about any monitoring mechanisms that exist to identify and filter out disinformation and other harmful content. And I know some of this regulation is still in progress, and so feel free to just talk about and disclose whatever you can. But this question is kind of to set the stage with respect to where we're at regarding a platform accountability and the regulation that exists.
the EU mostly has its framework in place, or the basis of it. So it comprises of the Digital Services Act, I'm sure you've all heard about it on the basic level, and the Code of Practice on Disinformation. The AI Act is also coming, and that will also add further to the sort of toolbox that we have from the regulatory space. But maybe a few words on the Digital Services Act. So how does it address disinformation? So the Digital Services Act takes the approach that the more societal role a platform plays, the more obligations it should have. So in particular for the very large online platforms, which are those with 45 million EU users or more, and now 19 of those have been designated, they need to very soon comply with a number of accountability measures which are within the law. Mostly and most importantly, what it does, it obliges them to have risk assessments, and it obliges that for them to assess risks on how the design and functionality of their platforms influences elections, civic discourse, also how illegal content is disseminated, and also how and to what extent the design and functionality of the platforms and systems and algorithmic systems can impact freedom of speech. So it is sort of an obligation to ensure that as a whole, they assess all these systemic risks which may arise due to the operations of their platform. And that is not all, so then they have to also take mitigating measures. And this all comes with a significant set of accountability mechanisms attached to it, and I think we're going to go into those a bit later. This is all informed also, and this is where the voluntary code of practice on disinformation will become useful. It's because the voluntary code of practice defines numerous sets of sort of success metrics and indicators that need to be reported on in the disinformation space, which will help the platforms figure out sort of where to meet those, where are the benchmarks when assessing their risks as a result of this particular space, which is actually really important because those don't exist necessarily in other areas that they have to assess the systemic risks on. So for disinformation, I think we're at a better place, also for the monitoring and accountability mechanisms that come sort of later on. But I think so that's basically the baseline, I would say.
Okay, so just a follow-up question, also as a part of setting the baseline. My understanding is these acts, the Digital Services Act and also the bill that is in progress in the UK doesn't specifically define, I know with respect to the Digital Services Act, doesn't specifically define illegal content or content that is harmful. Leah and Agne, could you just kind of share a little bit more on how these acts and bills potentially will articulate with existing laws within the jurisdictions related to the definition of illegal content or content that is harmful?
Sure, go for it.
Sure. So for the DSA, what it does is, because it applies across the EU, it doesn't define, it just says illegal content is content that is illegal under EU law or any member state law. So this allows to ensure that the definitions of illegality can evolve over time, and they will automatically then apply also to the platforms that are regulated, ensuring some flexibility, because otherwise you don't want to change this law every time you have to update the concept of illegal content. The DSA does not define disinformation, and it does not oblige any platform to take it down. This is particularly because of the concerns that may arise with free speech, because misinformation, as we know, is not illegal per se. It's not illegal to say false. It's not illegal to say false things. And this is why the onus of the regulation and the key focus of it is really looking at where the harm is created, right? So it's about the algorithmic systems that may propense harm, which is not created when there's individual pieces of falsehood. Also, just to say, so the DSA approached it from the perspective of so freedom of speech. I think often we think of freedom of speech as sort of an absolute right, but it has to be understood within all of the charter rights. There's over 50 of them, and they all have to be balanced against each other. So protecting freedom of speech isn't removing only barriers to the ability to speak freely. It is also about creating an environment where all voices can be heard. And so we, of course, also know that there are situations where, because one voice or some voices can speak so freely, they can also harass others and thereby remove those from the space of free speech. So this is also about setting the sort of guardrails to allow free speech to actually be free. So this is also within this risk management framework, is to balance freedom of speech with removal of illegal content, with addressing algorithmic risks.
Yeah, and similarly, the regime, the online safety regime, when it comes into play, is very much a regime focused on the systems and processes of in-scope platforms. So Ofcom's not going to be adjudicating on singular pieces of content. As Agne said, it's really about getting into the heart and driving forward improvements in safety by design and platform design, so that we are mitigating online harms at their root cause. And again, I think the onus is really on platforms to say, implement the policies and that they say that they are doing, and then Ofcom will ensure that they are actually adhering to the safety duties under the regime. And just a sort of bit more context about Ofcom, as I mentioned, we've been a regulator for 20 years. And so we have a really strong understanding of the importance of ensuring that freedom of expression is respected. The Act, when it comes into play, has a duty for services to take freedom of expression into account across all of its duties. And that's something that we have been focusing on in the way in which we create our codes of practice. When the bill gets to Royal Assent in the autumn this year, we will actually be putting out our first consultation document, which is on illegal harms, and we will be following that process throughout over the next couple of years for various different areas of the regime. And there are also specific duties, again, to uphold freedom of expression within the bill. So there's not only a duty for just everything to be, companies to really be taken into account freedom of expression, but then there are also specific duties that a subset of in-scope companies will need to focus on, thinking around content of democratic importance, or journalistic content, or news published content as well.
Okay, great. I mean, I hear both of you talking a lot about freedom of expression and free speech rights and kind of balancing that from a regulatory standpoint. As a capital markets researcher, we are typically used to seeing financial market regulation that puts forth requirements with respect to what firms can disclose, either in periodic filings or in news reports, conference calls, et cetera. So my next question, and I'd love for Stefan to kick us off on this one, is to talk about, why do we have so much regulation when it comes to financial disclosures that also, misinformation there can definitely have great harm from a financial perspective. But when it comes to platforms like social media platforms, yes, regulation is afoot. However, we see very little or less regulations in that space, where you can say misinformation and disinformation can have a much greater impact when it comes to societal harm. So Stefan, could you share a little bit more about why you think it's been so difficult to regulate, speech or expression on social media platforms versus what we are a lot used to in seeing in the financial markets?
Yeah, thanks, Nerissa. That's a good question. If I were a cynical person, I would say that a lot of very wealthy and powerful people invest money in the markets, and they want their money and their power to be protected, and that's why they come down hard on people who mislead them. You can think about Elizabeth Holmes, who attracted a lot of attention, should we say, and who got a lot of investments this way. So that's the cynical answer, but the cynical answer is never one, I think, that is very constructive. So I'll try a slightly different angle. It took us economic crisis of global proportions several times throughout the 20th century, and a string of Ponzi schemes and frauds, Enron, Bernie Madoff, and all those things, to arrive at the type of restrictive speech environment that we now have when it comes to financial reporting. So we've really learned from a lot of things that went terribly wrong, and we drew the conclusions, the lessons from it, because the fallout was just so devastating. What is still comparatively new by that standard is what we have now with the online environment that social media has created for speech, and the ability that it has to amplify whatever it is that someone wants to put out there. Remember that for most of the 20th century, we were dealing with gatekeepers. Big media corporations, journalists were the gatekeepers to these mass mediums. And yes, they had their problems, but they certainly were mostly not letting completely insane disinformation onto the front page of the New York Times, barring some exceptions, for instance. That has really changed quite dramatically in the last 20, 30 years or so with the internet and then with social media. So I guess in one way of answering this is to say, well, to ask ourselves, what is the qualitative difference between lying on an annual financial report, lying to your shareholders, and lying to the public about COVID, about elections, and about all these other things? I would say there really isn't that much of a difference, but maybe we haven't as a society, and I broadly mean societies that live in a democratic representative system that endorses human rights, because if you don't have that, then I think you're already having a very different discussion when it comes to disinformation. But within that context, maybe we just haven't had the massive fallout yet, or maybe it hasn't reached enough people, and this is why I think especially a summit like the one that we have today is so important, because it shines a light on that. Actually, the problem is massive, and maybe the difference is the rationales that we have for restricting speech in financial reporting is actually easily transferable to these other contexts, and maybe that's exactly what you should be doing. That's certainly what I think, and that's certainly, I think, the view that I try to defend in my scholarship.
Okay, so I hear you're saying a lot of it is because, one, societal harm sometimes is not easy to quantify, but maybe on a financial markets perspective, you can quantify harm there. And then also, and we see this also in the financial reporting space and the securities law space, where regulation tends to be fairly reactive. And so from your perspective, we just have not had that history where we can actually quantify, okay, societal harm leading from disinformation on open media.
Yeah, especially societal harm when it masquerades as as we've seen today throughout a lot of the panels, as it's just asking a question, right? Mm-hmm. So who could possibly fault someone for asking the question whether COVID vaccinations are safe? Because on the one hand, that is very innocent, right? And that is obviously the kind of thing that you would think that is exactly the type of stuff that you would want to protect under freedom of expression, because you want people to be able to voice their concerns honestly and truthfully, and you want them to get the answers that they need. On the other hand, it is obviously an abuse of that right if you start to use it in a way that essentially doesn't really ask questions anymore, but in fact presents answers that the person who's saying them knows to be unlawful, or let's say untruthful at the very least. That being said, not every lie is legally significant, nor do I think it should be, right? There are many host of areas in personal lives and in social relationships where, as a society, we're completely okay with, if not morally, at least legally okay with people deceiving other people. That is, for the most part, that's fine. Where it changes is when you either enter into a special relationship of trust, with the society as a whole or with the individuals that you're talking to, or indeed when the fallout from what it is that you're saying is so potentially so devastating that then I think that's the point where you start talking about some of the restrictions that both Agne and Leah mentioned. That's where we need to talk about this type of regulation. That's where it comes in ultimately. But freedom of speech is on both sides of that equation. It's not simple. It's not a simple matter of saying, oh, I should be able to say what I want because freedom of expression, nor is it as simple as saying, well, you no longer benefit from freedom of expression just because you told a lie. Neither of those things are true. I think we need to be able to hold this dichotomy, this cognitive dissonance to an extent.
Okay, so now you would say that the time has come for us to actually do something with respect to accountability related to social media platforms and actually put monitoring and auditing mechanisms in place. And on top of that, of course, there's a myriad of questions and hurdles, mainly with respect to the Balancing Act related to free speech rights and free expression. We're not going to be able to address all of those questions and hurdles today, but I have a few that I'd love for you guys to discuss for the audience, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A. So the first is we know the Digital Services Act is at play, and also a bill in the UK. So the question is it really plausible to develop a set of uniform standards around accountability and fundamental free speech rights on online platforms? And especially in the light of the fact that, I'm going to cite that we recently saw in the US legal challenge from Elon Musk actually stating that platform dissemination rules from the US Securities and Exchange Commission violated his free speech rights. So in light of that, even though that there are mechanisms that are currently being developed, should we expect more of these challenges? And again, across the three of you, can you really say that we can actually have a strong system of accountability with respect to disinformation and misinformation on social media platforms? It's a very loaded question.
So from the Ofcom perspective, I think, again, if we take a step back, we're a founding member of the DRCF, which is the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. So that's actually working with other regulatory bodies in the UK, such as the Financial Conduct Authority, so thinking through some of the points that Stefan was just making, as well as the Competition and Market Authority and the Information Commissioner. So, this is about kind of bringing together the expertise of other areas of regulation that have a vested interest in online safety and ensuring that there's a joined-up approach to regulation so that actually we are pushing forward with best practice and can learn as well from our peers. And again, at the international level, we've also been part and set up another international forum working with other independent regulatory bodies at the global level that are again pushing forward with online safety regulation. Partners in Ireland, Australia, Canada, and various other countries. So I think there's definitely a drive towards this, really focusing in on the systems and processes that companies are utilizing and shining a light on these systems and processes and actually driving improvements all the way up to, board level and making the necessity of safety sort of run throughout entire organizations. And what I will say is, especially for the online safety bill as it currently is, this regulation for the UK is in its nascent stages. And regulation by itself is not the kind of silver bullet for sort of solving all online harms and ills. But definitely, there is progress being made in a really positive direction. And from Ofcom's perspective, we're very much ready to go when the bill does eventually become an act this autumn.
Yeah, Agne, do you want to go? Okay. I'd like to zoom out just a little bit further and state, that's obviously very hard to come up with a standard for regulation of online platforms and for the protection of free expression that is acceptable in all jurisdictions. I would say it's not just difficult, it's probably impossible. That's because even if you're limiting yourself to, let's say, representative democracies with an interest in human rights protection, even if you limit yourself in that way, there is a broad spectrum of views on it. I don't need to belabor that argument too much, but compare US First Amendment with European Convention on Human Rights, you see it's a world of difference on many important questions that relate to regulation. So on that level, I'm sympathetic with the companies, because it is hard, and you're not going to arrive at a standard for free expression that is acceptable in the US and in Europe. That's just not going to happen. Holocaust denial is a non-starter in most European countries for good reason. That is protected under the US First Amendment, clearly. So that's an important thing to note. There is that discrepancy there. My sympathy is nonetheless quite limited when it comes to these companies because no one forces them to operate in all these different markets and all these differing jurisdictions with all their different legal standards simultaneously. No one's forcing them to do that. They don't have to do that. They don't have to globally integrate. They choose to do so because they want to make money and they're in search of new markets, clearly. But if that's a problem, if that creates problems for you, then, well, I'm sorry, that's just how it is. And if the answers that these companies end up giving us to the problems that they are creating this way, dissemination of hate speech, disinformation, taking down posts by dissidents, for instance, in Turkey because they supposedly insulted the current ruler, all these types of things, if they create these moral hazards and these companies don't resolve them in a way that is satisfactory to us, then we need to think about tougher regulation. And in the final instance, it is not at all unprecedented for certain harmful industries to be regulated out of existence. I can name a couple, but asbestos industry is one of them in Europe. It's dead. It doesn't exist anymore because there was just no way of getting it to operate in a way that we felt was morally and ethically acceptable. So I think that's a range of options. It doesn't need to go that far, but I think those options should be on the table. And yes, if these global conglomerates can't operate in a way that is conducive to human flourishing, then yeah, maybe they need to be broken up. Maybe that's the answer.
Okay, and Agne, a question that I'll throw out to you as a follow-up to that is, in your current role and former role, especially in working with companies to make sure that they're, putting in place effective systems to monitor and have accountability with respect to misinformation and disinformation. Could you share a little bit about some of the measures and mechanisms that you've actually seen in practice in first trying to identify misinformation and disinformation and try to root that out? I think that would be great for the audience to hear as well.
Sure. If I may, I'm going to just take one moment back and sort of comment a little bit on what has... So just to say on the overarching element of where we are in the time frame, right? If we compare ourselves to sort of the financial regulatory space, I think we're about like a decade, 15 years behind maybe, because I do think actually those moments have happened, right? Those moments of shock have already happened. And I think the Digital Services Act, the upcoming AI Act, the Online Safety Bill, the great work done by the E-Safety Commissioner in Australia in the context of the Online Safety Act. These are all testament to that, right? There is a flurry of regulatory initiatives and other initiatives that are happening. There's this Trust and Safety Professional Association. Trust and Safety is now an umbrella term which unifies professionals that are working on these issues in-house in these companies. They're incredibly dedicated people really trying to address harmful behaviors, harmful actions, coming up with all sorts of ideas of how to do this, right? But everyone is working against, challenging incentives, different incentives in terms of what the business is. And I think we're just in the beginning of all of this. We have so few standards and benchmarks in this space that I think in 5 years from now, we're going to have an extremely different conversation about this space in general. So maybe that's one. And two, on the accountability perspective, I think, so the DSA, and I go back to the DSA because that's what I know best, but the DSA set out an accountability framework, which I think is quite interesting. And let's see how well it works, right? Because it hasn't been fully implemented yet, so we don't know. So it's about now figuring out sort of what worked and what didn't. But what it does, it has several layers of accountability. So first is the accountability within the company itself. They have to conduct a risk assessment, they have to deploy mitigating measures, they have to have a compliance function in place. So I'm speaking only of the very large online platforms here, but those are, I think, the most relevant in this space to the largest extent. And this is actually taking very much from the financial regulatory space, right? Very much in the drafting of the DSA, and those familiar with financial regulation will see some similarities there, especially around how the compliance function and the risk assessment framework has been set up. And then all of these systems and elements will have to be accountable to the management board, right? So it's actually about driving those risks and the assessment of those risks to the very top management, because that is not a given in a company. It's not a given that the trust and safety professionals will manage to go to top management. So this is just about making the levers inside the company, or pushing that at least that you have the risks that are to societal risks are on top of the top management, that they reach actually top management. Then there's a layer of accountability towards the user. Any content moderated the user has to be given notification that this was moderated. This is for removal, this is for demotion of content. And the user can contest this. The user has an avenue now to communicate with the platform, being like, hey, I don't agree with your decision. And the platform can, of course, say, well, these are our terms and conditions. But if you have enough users saying, we disagree with this is not okay, then that can also drive policy change within the platform, and it's an opportunity of communicating with the users. There's also an accountability towards, of course, the regulator, but there's also an accountability to the auditors. There's an internal audit, which is also taken very much from the financial regulation. And those auditors are going to grapple with the lack of standards and benchmarks. So anyone auditors in the room, this is going to be a rough ride for the first few years, I think. And then there's, of course, also, and there's lots of researchers in the room, and there's a requirement to provide access to data for researchers. And this is a very important accountability element, because it's also an accountability to the regulators themselves and to the auditors. So it's an accountability of the system, because if a researcher goes in and conducts analysis which actually says that, you know what you've said, like, platform is incorrect and here's my research, and auditors, you said that's fine, and then regulators, what are you doing about this? So there's, and then finally you have the transparency, sort of quantitative transparency reports that will be published every year, but also all of these levels will recreate public reporting. So there's transparency towards civil society and towards the population as a whole. And I think it's about the combination of how will we now manage to put these levers into practice. That is where accountability may eventually arise. And I think we're just in the beginning of this. So I think 5 years' time, it will be interesting to look back at, how did we do?
And your discussion about a system of accountability and talking about the internal audit mechanism really ties into having trust in that system, especially for users. So the last question I'll throw out there for each of you to touch on before we turn it over to Q&A is, what is the role of penalties or enforcement penalties in that system of accountability, which is something that we've seen on the financial markets regulation side, where when you levy penalties, of course, when you catch bad actors and you levy penalties, it also sets up not only deterrence, but it shows in the financial markets to investors and here with respect to social media platform users that, hey, the system of accountability is actually going to try to root out bad actors, and it actually has some teeth. So can you each kind of just talk a little bit about how you see enforcement and penalties actually playing a role in this system of accountability?
Sure. So from the perspective of Ofcom, we have got a real understanding of the power of enforcement, and as an independent regulator, and I do think the independence of the regulator, again, is really key when you're thinking through accountability and building trust, actually. It's that Ofcom is very much seen in the UK as a trusted body that acts with integrity, transparency, fairness, and proportionality. And that is absolutely the way that we will be, regulating under the Act for online safety. I think, though, again, the sort of the financial penalty enforcement side of things is really important. And from the bill's perspective, fines can be laid for up to 10% of revenue. So these are hefty fines for companies, in-scope companies, to be considering. And so I think all of the levers that Agne's mentioned, the transparency, so that actually there's better understanding of what is going on inside a platform, access to information through information gathering requests, these hosts of levers do really provide an opportunity to ensure that we drive accountability through the platforms that are in scope of the Act. But I think it's important that, if there is a need to, Ofcom will act. We have the knowledge and know-how to do so in a proportionate manner. But that is why that kind of ability has been built into the bill, and we see that again. There's similarities across other similar forms of regulation globally as well.
All of that, absolutely agree. The only other thing that I would pick out is that there also needs to be a degree of outcome consistency, right? Because I think one of the big problems that you could say that where currently social media platforms especially, but not exclusively, falls short, is on the consistency of their decision-making process, right? So for a lot of people, these decisions look arbitrary. And they look arbitrary because on the one hand, the hammer comes down on maybe expressions and posts and videos that don't necessarily warrant it. And on the other hand, the hammer doesn't come down on quite persistent offenders in many ways, right? So a big question in terms of building trust, and also I think this is in the interest of the companies as well as the regulators, it's to ensure that there is actually a degree of consistency in those decisions, and also that it creates the type of speech environment that both Agne and Leah were talking about, the one where it's not just about the loudest voices being able to say whatever comes to their mind, but actually it being an environment where everyone feels that they are able to say what they want and able to be heard to the extent that it falls within the lines of what is accepted on those platforms. So I think that is a tricky one because we are dealing with a species of private law here, right? So these platforms tell you about their community standards and like the guidelines for being a nice person on those platforms, but effectively this is a contract, right? You're entering into a contract. And so one of the big questions that courts will have to answer throughout the years, I think, is also whether or not the interpretation and the enforcement of these contracts, especially because it relates so closely to freedom of expression, needs to actually be impacted and influenced by the way that we think freedom of expression operates with respect to the state. So in other words, do we need horizontal application of these rights, at least in a more limited sense?
I think that will also be very difficult for regulators to put penalties on, which is such a challenging sort of set of incentives to then say, did you get it right or not? But I think in terms of the financial penalties, of course, they're there for a reason, right? They act as a deterrence. Without strong financial penalties, maybe platforms will be doing nothing at the moment, right? But they are definitely taking a lot of very dedicated action to meet the regulatory standards across the globe. Now, I think there I would again look back to banking. I'm pretty sure there was a very, very large penalty in the banks at some point in time, which the question is, there is of course compliance, and then there is another level of compliance. And I think that is the question, will we, there will be compliance across the market to a certain level, and then the question is, do we need a very large and hefty fine for that compliance to be sort of upgraded into another level of sort of seriousness. And if I'm not mistaken, I think there was a BNP Paribas fine at some point, which really triggered the market into looking at compliance in a more serious way. So I think, it's left to be seen whether this is needed here, but humans are how they are, so likely.
Okay, great. So we have about 13, 14 minutes left, which hopefully should be some healthy time for Q&A from the audience. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys to ask questions to our panelists. So the first hand I see is to the left side.
Thank you. My name is Lucas. I'm from Bocconi University. My question is more towards Agnes. Concerning the DSA, recital number 14 basically excludes private messaging services. So if you think of disinformation campaigns and how disinformation spreads through this, through WhatsApp, Telegram, for example, would you think that the DSA is directly tackling disinformation in the most effective way? And if there is, from the Commission or from another institutional body of the EU, another regulatory perspective towards these platforms, these messaging platforms. And also in terms, and this for the whole the general panel, what do you think of the idea of digital constitutionalism and Brussels effect? So how do we consider this digital sovereignty debate and how it portrays online transnational regulation of platforms? Thank you.
So recital 14 so basically it excludes, recital 14 speaks about the difference between what is public and what is private, and that is used to differentiate between hosting services and online platforms. Basically, the DSA says the closer a platform gets to being, super central between the communication of users in a systemic way, then the more responsibility they have. And the levers they put there, it says hosting services, for example, like Amazon Web Hosting or Dropbox, do not nearly have that type of public effect, meaning they will have less obligations. So that is what recital 14 is there for, and therefore it also excludes private communication. It's a similar way that they've done in the terrorist content online regulation. Messaging services are still covered by the DSA, but they have very limited obligations. It's a bit different, though, because for example, when you mention WhatsApp, but if we mention Telegram and the open channels in Telegram, those are still covered by the online platform rules, for example. So, yeah, it is not, it is difficult to hit all the levers at once because it's very difficult, like the other rules that apply to online platforms definitely should not apply to WhatsApp. You would not want that, right? Because they would be extremely intrusive for our privacy. However, so if you are a very large online platform and you have a messaging service, which is part of your overall online platform, you'll have to address that functionality in the risk assessment. So it's covered from that perspective. However, and there's also the Code of Practice on Disinformation, and Meta does give also data on WhatsApp there. So there are sort of other levers in place for that particular aspect. But no, it doesn't cover it with the same logic, but there are some elements which are covered. Was there another question?
Stefan, do you want to address the second part of the question related to...
Just briefly to say that, of course, the European Union is going to be at the forefront of some of this regulation if one of the biggest markets for social media platforms, and I'm talking here about the US, has consciously or not consciously taken itself out of the game, right? So if you stand on an interpretation of the First Amendment that basically says any form of government regulation of speech, barring some very strange exceptions that I won't get into today, but whatever, there are some strange exceptions, but the party line is no regulation, then you're not going to be at the forefront of global regulation. That's just how it is. I think it's important to have American voices in this debate because I don't think that the EU is infallible, and I don't think that our interpretation of freedom of expression is infallible. But at the same time, if the answer is, well, the answer is not to regulate, then that's a non-starter from my perspective, given what we are talking about today.
Okay. Anything to add?
Just very briefly, to your second point, I think you point to the importance of that international cooperation, because there are different jurisdictions. And so, again, I think from Ofcom's perspective, the work that we're doing with our international network is really trying to think through some of those issues and also focusing on various challenges that I think are cross-border. So I think one of the focuses for the network at the moment is on age assurance. At the domestic level, the work plan for this year focuses on, I think it's algorithmic transparency and auditing. So again, it's finding these areas where there is a common interest to drive forward collaboration to make sure that there is best practice being shared. And I think that we'll see more of that in the future.
Okay. Question?
Hi, my name is Shannon Pearson. I'm an affiliate at the Monroe Center for Technology and Democracy, and I had a question for Agne. I was wondering, I know that you were specifying that the DSA focuses and applies to platforms with a greater societal role. I was kind of wondering, how the DSA will evolve as the internet becomes more decentralized and we kind of enter Web3. Because in the US, we've seen how moderation during election cycles and especially during the pandemic the moderation and the rules has alienated users on the platform and has actually pushed them off platform to decentralized environments where platforms actively don't moderate or don't have policies, and it's kind of become more and more decentralized. So I was kind of wondering, while those platforms don't necessarily have the greatest societal role, as more of those smaller platforms begin to grow, how do you expect the DSA to kind of evolve to tackle the issues on those platforms and to obligate those platforms to actually enforce the rules, as those unmoderated environments can be really, we can see kind of the worst of the worst in terms of hate speech and just illicit materials. So I was just kind of wondering what your take was on that.
Sure. So the DSA does cover hosting services, and most of the decentralized platforms, so when we speak of Mastodon servers, for example, are hosting services. And even though, so they're very likely not online platforms, the threshold there is that they have to be medium-sized services to be online platforms. But they are then under the DSA hosting services, so they have obligations under the DSA. They have to have a notice and action mechanism, meaning they have to allow users to report illegal content, and they need to send them also a statement of reasons when they remove illegal content. To what extent they will comply with these rules is to be seen, but they have a very basic set of obligations as well. So, there's probably a range of things that DSA didn't manage to think about, but it's to be seen sort of how it's integrated. And I can't comment on what particular actions the Commission may take in the future to this effect, but there is a large part of it which is covered because they are in effect hosting services.
Next question.
We have a question from the online audience for the panel. Specifically, they ask, what will be the effect of this new regulation on firms overall in terms of competitiveness and innovation? Because smaller firms will perhaps face greater costs in implementing this regulation, while only large firms will be able to effectively implement them. So do you see any danger on competitiveness and innovation, especially for the case of fines for non-compliance?
Leah, maybe do you want to start from an online safety bill perspective?
Sure. So I think proportionality is, again, one of the real central tenets, both of the bill and of and of Ofcom. We're very much, alive to issues around competition and also innovation. And so there are going to be sort of a subset of rules for a certain smaller amount of platforms, probably the larger ones. I can't sort of comment too much as the bill's still, going through Parliament. But I think that those concerns about proportionality are baked into the way in which the bill has been designed, so that there won't be, a disproportionate effect on smaller companies, and is also very much in our psyche as we are creating our codes of practice, our risk assessment guidance, and again, we're engaging through our calls for evidence on the various different areas of the bill with multidisciplinary stakeholders to ensure that actually what is proposed and then what is put out for companies to follow is proportionate and doesn't negatively affect companies, say, that are smaller.
Yeah, the same goes for the DSA. It brings a very staggered approach. So it's also there are lots of exceptions for small and medium-sized companies. Really trying to make sure that there is a proportionality, and that has been very much baked into the system. And also maybe there's there's more and more vendors on the market, so more and more providers offering software, sort of content moderation software, or different types of tooling, helping companies actually comply with this. The company that I work provides an end-to-end content moderation software, but there's a couple of others. These have emerged in the past 2 years, so they didn't exist before either. So these are also going to be crucial for compliance with some of these process obligations, right, which are part of the DSA, which are part of the OSB, which are part of the Online Safety Act in Australia.
Okay, so I see a question over here, and then I know there's one over here. I'm going to get to you next.
Yeah, thanks. I'm Stephen Lewandowski, University of Bristol. I just want to provide some data to give it a bit of perspective when we talk about moderation, because my colleagues and I just published a paper a couple of months ago where we looked at, it was a massive study polling Americans' attitudes towards content moderation and removal of posts and blocking of accounts. And the overarching finding was that people are actually okay with content moderation. They do support the removal of misinformation that is demonstrably causing harm. So anything that they consider to be harmful, they want to have removed. That was true even for Republicans, although less so than for Democrats. There was a partisan split, but it wasn't as extreme as one might think. So this free speech fundamentalism that Elon Musk, for example, is sort of talking about, actually does not find broad support among the public. And I think that's an important thing to keep in mind as background.
Okay, thanks for sharing that. We have a next question here.
Yeah, Joachim Gassen, Humboldt University, Germany. Thank you for this fascinating panel. I have a question with regards to large language models. So you are talking a lot about platform accountability, and I see that the idea is to hold the corporations that actually run these platforms accountable, and I think this makes a lot of sense. But now, given that we have more and more large language models that actually can be spun up by single individuals even, I wonder how would this model of regulation apply to these type of, let's say, talking agents, basically? Do they have freedom of speech? And if so, how do we enforce that they don't step over the line?
Go ahead.
Stefan, that should be right up your alley.
So large language models don't have freedom of speech, but the material that they use to learn it was probably written by people who do. That's an IP question. I'll keep that to one side for now, I think. Well, in the end, the person who uses it, right? So I think the person who provides the large language model or the person who ends up using it for their purposes will have to ultimately be legally responsible for what it produces, right? So if that algorithmic model starts spewing out Holocaust denial and hate speech, then yeah, you might not have an individual to prosecute, but you definitely have a company, an individual, or someone to regulate. So I think that's where the rubber sort of meets the road for me. I'm very consequentialist on that. Whoever uses it and who tries to derive benefit from it is ultimately also the one who's going to be responsible for whatever it ends up producing. So that's how I would approach that, but that is very tentative at this point. I really need to see more about how these things evolve over the next few years.
Okay, I know we're at time, but I'd love to take one more question at the front right here.
Thank you very much. Mahi Santini from Brazil, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. I would ask if DSA consider ads within this idea of free speech rights. I know that DSA require transparency for ads, but I would like to ask if it includes responsibility too for the advertisers or for the platforms. Because in Brazil we are watching an epidemic of ad frauds, scammers, and things like that. That's why I'm asking.
The DSA in its risk, so one, it has a transparency function, so there is an ad repository that will have to be set up by the very large online platforms. And in its risk assessment, it needs to consider to what extent its advertising policies and the way it sort of serves ads and the ads on its platform contribute to the societal and systemic risks. So I think it has a component where they have to analyze to what extent that entire advertising system that comes into their platform contributes to election integrity, civic discourse, and all of those spaces. So to that extent, yes.
Okay, well, thank you for the great questions. I'd like to really thank our panelists, Agne, Stefan, and Leah for the awesome discussion. And so with that, we're going to wrap up our panel. And thank you again to our panelists. Please give them a round of applause.